Thank you all for being here tonight. This is really an embarrassment of riches over the past week, from having our Italian colleagues and friends come and bring Botticelli's works into open boxes and see masterpieces, to having 3 nights of openings. Hopefully you came. There were 600 total Friday night when the Italian ambassador got to speak, and I hope that Melissa will call me. We have a full overflow crowd at the museum watching on Facebook Live, both on the internet, on our Facebook page, and also in the museum. So Melissa said if for some reason the audio wasn't coming through, she would send a carrier pigeon via my phone in my pocket. So we're really excited. How many people saw the article in the Wall Street Journal today? Well, good, only 30%. So there was a major feature story in the Wall Street Journal today and online. And of course, that's millions and millions of media impressions across the world. And how many of you all came to the Tuesday night topics in architecture? Monday night, sorry. Okay, about 20%. So good, only 20% is going to hear what I said then. 2 weeks ago, ArtNet News, one of the top internet art news sites, ran the story of the Botticelli exhibition, and what they do then on Saturdays is they take the 10 most popular stories and put out a list of 10. Well, the Botticelli was number 1 in the world. So, so we have many people to thank for that, and including, and you're going to hear from John Spike. No one could have done this, and I've said that now more than once on these exhibitions. The expertise just simply doesn't exist in a way to spin a narrative and tell a story the way that John does it, and the way that our wonderful staff works with our international colleagues to then pull off. They don't just deliver these works, you pull them out of the boxes, you put them up, move them around. You have to actually take the work from a box to a condition report, to its spot on the wall, and it doesn't change. So it all has to be very pre-planned. And so for those of you asking us, which I'm starting to hate, what are you going to do next? I'm not so sure how many rabbits we have to pull out of this old busted up hat. But we may have 1 or 2, in fact. Another bit of good news, just this afternoon we finished negotiations to get to signing our contract with our architect. And I know that I have broken the rules in the past and mentioned who that architect is, but I can tell you as an alum who sat in this room 30 years ago for many, many hours of classes, to come back to your alma mater and work with a top 5 architect in the world on a building at one of the greatest, most historic and prestigious universities in America is daunting, and it's humbling, and we really appreciate it. So before we get started, I wanted to talk about brand value. EBB is the sponsor of our Third Thursday lectures, and I don't think Botticelli has been associated with a bank since Lorenzo the Magnificent and the Medici Bank. So I told Mark I had some special things from tonight, so we're likening Mark Hanna here in the front row, their generosity, his brilliance, to line up Botticelli, EBB, Lorenzo the Magnificent was his name, and the Medici Bank, really the first significant franchised banking and checking institution in the world. So we want to thank EBB and Mark and his colleagues. This has been now many years of their support of this. It's a wonderful relationship. I understand from Mark we're going to be changing the logo and the name again soon. They're involved in another merger which has been announced, and so we'll make sure that Mark's face stays the same, maybe the logo and the name changes, but we really appreciate the fact that a rising tide floats all the boats. So you all have heard John Spike speak for many, many years, and that's why there is a total overflow crowd in the museum. We will have the EDB reception afterwards, so if you all make your way over there, it's just and join us in our celebration in our community of this embarrassment of riches. So thank you very much, John. Thank you. The microphone is one that doesn't come up to your face, so you have to just talk at it. So I hope the folks can hear over there.
sit here.
I'm already receiving complaints from the overflow audience in the museum. And reading between the lines, I better speak quickly and get this over with so that the drinks and refreshments are still there when we arrive. I mean, I think I detect a veiled threat. Melissa Paris, is this loud enough? Today, I'm going to talk about the exhibition from a different perspective from when I spoke about the exhibition when it was coming. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to go deeper into the works, and I'm going to talk about how do we know what we know? How do we know that these works are by these artists, and how do we know what the dates of them are? Being able to identify the works correctly, being able to date them with some accuracy are sine qua non first steps towards understanding them. And this is in fact also the theme of our exhibition that's on the ground floor in the museum. That's called The Art and Science of Connoisseurship, in which we explain how those names come about, where they come from, to what extent they are new, and so forth. Now, drum roll, please. How many people recall seeing this slide before? This was the last slide I showed last November when I gave the talk. And I did so to say, we're going to pull this off, and there's going to be a show in February 2017. There's an Italian expression, una promessa è un dovere, a promise is an obligation. And we have confirmation that we did pull it off in this superlative full-page review that came out today in the Wall Street Journal. And this continues it, and this will go out on their news network and will carry the Muscarelle, or as the Italian couriers say, the Muscarelle, the Muscarelle Stendardo, banner ever higher. Here are some scenes to refresh your memory or to give you a start if you haven't had an opportunity yet to see the exhibition upstairs. And the key to this exhibition is apparent to all visitors. It's very carefully laid out with sight lines that unite the works and suggest the rapport between them, and there is. And the Italian couriers, all of whom know these works, first of all, when they entered the space, because of the ambience that we created, they gasped. They gasped with surprise. They didn't imagine it would be possible to show them these familiar works in a new way. And then they said to me, the works, the way you've arranged them, are like voices speaking to each other. The pictures speak to each other across the room and down the walls. And then they gave me credit for all kinds of juxtapositions that I had not intended. But following the wise words of St. Francis de Sales, who said, it is always necessary to tell the truth. It is not always necessary to speak. I smiled sympathetically when I received credit for terrific things that were happy happenstance. In this first room, and I'm going to surprise you because that's very much my character. I love to fulfill expectations you didn't have. The first room is about his formation, and it's his formation with his master, Filippo Lippi. In studying Italian art, the first thing you need to know always is who was the master of this artist you're studying, who was his teacher. And those of us who study Italian art know hierarchies, family trees of artist and pupil, artist and pupil. And it's extremely significant that Botticelli had the benefit of studying under the great early Renaissance master named Filippo Lippi, who was the only pupil of Masaccio. And I'm going to explain to you a bit of what that means. Now, the three works that are in a row on the left-hand wall are all from before the birth of Botticelli in 1445. And it was asked of me, how do we know that these works are by him? They aren't so different. And I said, well, there's actually 10 years difference time between them, and we know the other works that go with it. Here are two of the works there. You see one's of the early 1430s, and he studies with Masaccio in the year 1426. And the other one, which looks very different, is from around 1440. So how do we know these are even by the same painter? Well, it is because we know the paintings around them and in between them. And I'm going to show you just a few examples of this. And when you're done, you'll be amongst the leading art historians in the world. I wouldn't waste your time unless we aim for the top. Here we have 3 panels from what Masaccio did in 1426 after he had finished the part of the Brancacci Chapel he was going to do. This is a larger figure. The Polyptych of Pisa was dismantled, and it is divided mostly between the museums in London and Berlin, and that's St. Paul. And then these are 2 small figures of saints that were in vertical columns. And in 1996, if I am not mistaken, in my book on Masaccio, I said I thought that the far right Carmelite saint there, there's no other name known for it, we don't know who it is, so we call this one the beardless Carmelite saint. I thought that was by the young Filippo Lippi. And that becomes very important because the sources are vague about whether he studied really with Masaccio, but if he painted a piece in a work by Masaccio, well, that settles the discussion. And in the early part of the new century, because the Getty Museum acquired a saint related to this piece by Masaccio, related to this, or so they say, Altarpiece, the Polyptych of Pisa. The chap said, very politely, not mentioning me lest my feelings be hurt, he said he thought this was by Filippo Lippi. That was scholarly irony I was indulging in a second ago. But I'm just happy he did, because there you have it, confirmation from peers. And let me show you why I think. I showed this to you last time, this little visual aid here. See, the blue things are the part of the painting that in this Filippo Lippi show are like the saint on the right, which is in Berlin. The yellow are more typical of Masaccio, who doesn't care to get the forms as volumetric, as round. Everything that the beardless Carmelite saint, you see, he makes things bulk out, the head is round. And Masaccio is more of a painter. He loves color, too, whereas it's not a particular interest of Filippo. Here is another early work by Filippo Lippi, commonly accepted. And so you see, well, this is what we're thinking of. I'm trying to teach you that the works in the show stand in the front of the line that goes far back. And it's always this way. When you take a course, audit a course, I just learned, I'm going to take advantage of it right away, that since I'm over 60, I can audit the classes for free. This is these curious doll-like figures, because he only studied 1 year with Masaccio. He never had anatomical training. He really was a giant genius because he's truly self-taught, Filippo Lippi. At left, I show you the Masaccio center of that polyptych, so that you will see something that will make a lot more sense when I show this to you. Look where Filippo Lippi got this idea of the saints and angels and the child being these chubby cherubs doing natural things. It's very unusual. I never saw it before. The infant Christ is stuffing himself with Eucharistic symbolic grapes. It's typical of Fra Filippo Lippi to try to put lifelike gestures into his works, and he had a year with a man who was the first to do it, and it was influential for him. And this becomes part of Botticelli's greatness. The gestures are lifelike, only he tends to make them more refined. So I want to show you this pair again, and show you on the right, well, it does seem to have made some progress in the inter. This is to wake up those who are not at home. And if you're a rare glimpse of my lack of self-confidence, there's lots of them in the show. Plus, it's fascinating. Well, when you look at, for all you budding connoisseurs, when you look at a work of art, you must test yourself, because you want to know this. What is the condition of the work? What parts are restoration? How much is a filled-in crack by a restorer? Because these works are 500 years old, and they have suffered all kinds of indignities and natural chemical changes. But this one is particularly fascinating, and it is one of the reasons I was so intent on getting this loan for our show. You see, before, and aren't these very clear slides? I mean, give me credit, look at that. Before restoration, / after restoration, 2016. Does anyone see a difference between these pictures, or am I just deluding myself? At the dentist's office as a kid, that's what I loved to do, find 7 changes in this picture. Little did I know it would make it my career. At any rate, on the left-hand side, besides a rogue leg, there's all this cloudy stuff coming down the background, and that is muck. Technical term. That is accumulated debris on the surface, liquids, and the varnish itself is aging in an uneven way after a certain number of decades, and that it was to get rid of that, to make the work more presentable for exhibition. That, to their amazement, and I was talking to a scholar who had published this picture before, and was trying to argue with me that actually the left-hand side was fine, that this was what's called a pentimento. But it's not the way pentimentos come off, believe you me, or come up. So you see, they painted over the top of the side of the sarcophagus there, and added in some that polychrome stone, which is very important. It's a symbol of heaven. And over on the right-hand side, we see how it was. Now, it's not surprising somebody painted over that leg, because it's very, very awkward. That is why I love it. Tom was talking to me before about, I want to know more about how nature relates to these things. He is trying to be more natural. So instead of having everybody stand up like soldiers, he says, I'll have John the Evangelist here steadying himself against the wall of the tomb. I'll put my leg over it, as might have been done at the moment, but he doesn't have a sufficient knowledge of anatomy to pull it off. It looks really ridiculous. So probably an early 20th century art dealer fixed that up. But it is the most wonderful example of what it was like to be Fra Filippo Lippi, trying to do all things at all time. Now, there was another influence on him. He wasn't the #1 painter with the Medici. There was a much more sophisticated and learned and much better behaved painter named Frangelico. I say the behaved because Fra Filippo Lippi, as soon as he'd gotten some success, arranged to be the tutor of some nuns in Prato and ran off with one of them. And the painter Filippo Lippi in our show was their son. At any rate, Frangelico was much better behaved, and he was also more intellectual. He is trying to make timeless and very symbolic images, the one at left, and he puts in this rock and this tomb, and the body of the deceased Christ is being displayed in a cruciform pose, and all of this is overlapping the significances of it. This motif is called Corpus Domini. It's a feast. It was written about by a Dominican, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Frangelico was a Dominican. The Carmelites at right, that's who the order of Filippo Lippi, they trace their origin back to the hillsides in the Sinai and Holy Land, and they were a lot more relaxed. At any rate, he is trying to get a layer of poetic depth, Fra Filippo Lippi, which he wasn't before, because he's competing with Fra Angelico. Behind him, that astonishing rock hole there, well, that must allude to the tomb, but in the position of the thing, it's a favorite motif of Frangelico. It only rhymes in English, the coincidence of womb and tomb, because Christ emerges alive from both the womb and the tomb. And Christ is born in order to die. This is solid theology. Around the time, here's a work from around the time, so how do we write circa 1440? Well, this is a work, we don't have dated works for even, two within a 5-year period, there's very few, but here is a work, and the drapery folds are getting a little bit more elaborate, slightly more elegant. The background on this, meaning the one we have, the Pietà, is rather adroitly done. And in this, it's called the Barbadori Altarpiece. Came out of Santo Spirito. It's in the Louvre today. He got quite good at the architectural background. We still see the same cherubs pretending to be angels. In 1445, he does this for Santa Croce. And notice, again, is a little bit like ours. Everyone's pushed up to the front plane and lined up in a row. And the third painting that I'm not pausing to talk about, we don't have all night, the champagne is warming. On that wall is of this time, and that's why we know the other one on that wall by him. The third I referred to is from around this date. And there it is at left, Filippo Lippi and assistants. This is a small, rather well done picture, but everyone realizes that it's a little too simple to be by Fra Filippo Lippi, and plus he was totally busy painting the enormous fresco cycles he painted at the end of his life, multi-year projects in Prato and Spoleto. But when they offered this to us in consolation for not giving us something else that we had agreed for 6 months previously that we were going to get, I was, somewhat skeptical about it, but I looked into it and realized that the face of this angel is certainly by Botticelli while in the workshop of Filippo Lippi. And remember, I said that we get these loans because we promise to add to our knowledge about things. On the right-hand side is a picture by Botticelli that copies a Lippi. It's in the Innocenti, and this was accepted when it first came to light in the 1860s, and then in the 20th century. In the 20th century, there was a great excitement amongst scholars to say everything wasn't by the artist. And we ended up with a clearer picture, but actually the picture was incomplete. And now, by and large, people are understanding again why this has to be Botticelli. And what you can see here is, and this is, we're losing a little resolution here, but I studied a high-res photograph of it, which you can see more in it than you can with an enlargement of a high-res photograph. You can see more in it than you can with your naked eye. Has anybody recently, say 2 years ago, seen a very important exhibition of another great artist of this time? I give up. The subtlety of the modeling of this face says something about the quality of the skin. It's refined as though it's transparent. It's so smooth. And the gradations, it's impossible to see the strokes that make these gradations that model the volume of the cheeks. And this is super work. The only other painter, I have to know who the other painters are in the workshop, and the only other one of note is named Fra Diamante, and he is coarse and heavy. No worry about him. And this Innocenti picture is particularly interesting because it's directly based on a very famous Filippo Lippi that for some months Erin and I fantasized we were going to get here without them noticing they had lent us one of the most important pictures in the Uffizi. But I don't know, the spell passed, and they said, the Italian equivalent to us of, "Are you mad?" Well, so when the painting by Botticelli, very young, still in the studio, fell out of favor in the 20th century because it seemed so clear, well, the Lippi is so much better. But let's bear in mind, he's 20 years old and he's doing different things. Workshop stuff is to replicate the master. What is he doing? Instead of the interesting distance between Our Lady and the Lippi where she folds her hands in adoration, actually, Botticelli adds to the intimacy she reaches to take the child. He eliminates one of the two angels whose eyes are covered by the infant's arm there, and this is a typical Filippo Lippi motif where they're all jammed in those pictures. I've showed you a few, and Botticelli has an innate neatness. He loves outlines, and is a wonderful drawer of outlines, which you feel when you look at the painting I write, and actually when you look at I have a thing here. Let's see. When you look at this face, or this face, you do not say to yourself, I simply love the outlines on that. Now, he doesn't care about the outlines. He's always trying to make things volumetric. But this chap, everything is done with the most exquisite line. I almost feel that we've done enough. What do you think? We go get a drink. Well, let me know. Let me know. Well, we're leaving that part now, and we're entering the large gallery, and we have this painting here, over which we, as a team, the staff, because there's a few of us that we discuss every decision together. You know, is it confusing to have a picture not by Botticelli right there? Well, so far no complaints. It says there, it's not in. And this is important, this work by Playuolo, for reasons I'll show you. It's the transition, the influence of the two brothers, Playuolo. Their name is an elegant expression, chicken seller. Without their intervention, he wouldn't have become who he was. Yeah. So here is that Lippi that is lined up on the axis of the exhibition, and you can see it from any place in the show. And he did this in the time 1466, when Botticelli was working with him. And then he goes to Spoleto, and Botticelli goes and opens his studio in his family house in near Ognissanti, across the street from the Excelsior Hotel in Florence. And you see how close they are. They're very close, and the intimacy and tenderness of the embrace of mother and child is a specialty of Filippo Lippi that Botticelli was sensitive to. His model for Our Lady is more lifelike. You can still see people in the streets of Florence have this lovely face, and actually nobody looks like that. That is Filippo's imagination of something that's, you know, very, very nice looking. And the child is altogether more articulated. This seems okay, but really, the way that shoulder turns and the way his stomach is there, we see his back and his stomach at the same time, and it's not possible to do humanly. And her arm sort of comes from a place because Filippo didn't care about anatomy or never learned it. But it's a great thing to have this early work. And, yeah. You see, he first started working with them, and they did two things, the Playuolo brothers. One, they are supposed to be the first artists who actually did dissections on cadavers to learn anatomy, to learn how the muscles connect to the bones, and you see how they worry about the joints and how they move. They also get credit for being the first to systematically copy poses from classical art, from Roman art especially, but you cannot find a classical frieze of figures that they don't have this pose. Whoa, look! What do you know? That he is doing something. He had to realize this is what we're doing now. Now, another issue that is raised, the one on the far right is in our show. The one on the far left is in the Art Institute in Chicago. Because of some sort of powerful effect of 20th century auteur theory of filmmaking applied to Renaissance paintings, they went through, the scholars, the oeuvre, plural, of all these artists. They said, you know, one is the right one, and the other ones are all followers or replicas. And it caused a lot of confusion and misunderstanding of these artists. They had contracts with their students, their apprentices. They had to give them work to do. Perhaps they asked less money for the work if they didn't do it entirely themselves. But this is the way it was. Today I received a letter. I still call emails letters. I can't get past that. I received a letter from Jonathan Nelson, who's the leading authority on Filipino Lippi, the son of Filippo. And he's in Florence, and he read my catalog, the one that's just come out, and basically said how lucky we are that you have entered the field. With your sharp eye and lucid writing style. It didn't hurt that when I wrote back to his first inquiry, I said, your article is a major contribution that I ratify in my book. So I got something back. But as a typical example, the picture in Chicago, which early in the 20th century, some Chicago benefactor paid a fortune for this picture. For the last 40 years has been considered a piece of junk because it isn't the early work at Wright. It is a wonderful picture. And there's 1,000 examples like this, or at least 50, in which they think there's the one prototype and then everything is done by, who are these students who are so good? And so I put this in to cover that point too. One of the things we tried to do in the show was to represent everything, a portrait. How do you have a Botticelli show without a portrait? Well, we didn't make that mistake. A really good one. And now he's left Lippi, and he's mixing it up with the great Florentine painters at his time. He particularly is competing with Ghirlandaio, who paints faster than he does. And he starts making portraits, which are highly sought after, because really, being in the 1460s, people start to make portraits, and before that, nobody had any images at home, except the occasional Madonna. And you have to realize, we're talking about these images that were the first images that anyone had seen. He is one of the inventors with an artist named Andrea del Castagno of the challenging gaze. He looks at us, why do you deserve my time? Previously, they were just supposed to be historical artifacts. This is what somebody looked like. And they invent the psychology of portraits. Across the, or near this and across the room from the early one, is one of the very, very special pictures in the show. It is literally his most precious work, literally, because particle analysis has been done by the museum. They just told me it hasn't been published yet. That's pure lapis lazuli ground and mixed with the tempera. The green is malachite, and the gold is pure gold laid on thickly everywhere. This must have been for a very special, here are the three nails kind of symbolically of the Passion, crown of thorns, these marvelous halos. And here, as I've said to folks as I look at the show with them, here's 2 days of my life figuring out what that is. Those are flames. The flames, that is Stella Maris, and those are the flames of the Holy Spirit. And how do you look up things that have never been written? That's my problem. But I just looked and looked and looked and looked and looked through photographs until Berenson, the great connoisseur, said once, whoever has the most photographs wins. The writing in that was a lovely gesture. His hands on hers means he's guiding her. And in the Wall Street Journal review, the writer made a wonderful original observation saying he is looking at her, the child, with empathy, knowing the pain that she will suffer. It's like the couriers. They credited me with all sorts of things I didn't say. And that's a lovely remark. I mean, I had been saying, he's saying to her, here's a great part where I'm mentioned. I don't think it's as good as the newspaper had. Well, another very special thing about this painting, and this is only possible to do in a lecture. That's why we have these lectures. I can't put other photographs on the wall of the exhibition because they will fight for attention with the real works of art. But this in every way is stylistically close to the Primavera. And I don't know another work by Botticelli that is this close. She really looks with her golden hair like the fourth Grace dancing there. And that makes it very special to us because this is this moment of high Laurentian. The adjective from Lorenzo for Lorenzo Magnifico, high Laurentian classical philosophy and poetry. This fresco in the show it was the most famous work by him on public view during his lifetime in Florence. And on the basis of this, it caused a sensation. He was supposed to do it in, he did it in competition with a work by Ghirlandaio. And it was considered to be a competition that Botticelli won. And an agent for the Duke of Milan was asked to summarize who are the best painters in Florence. 10 years later, he said Botticelli is the best painter, and because he has a virile manner. Well, this isn't how any of us think of him today, his aria virile, but this work, yes, for a saint who's rapt, having a vision, eyes lifting up, he is as virile as could be. The Galvan looks a little bored. That's not really much competition. This has a whole story that you can read about on the label. On the strength of that fresco, 2 years later, he's part of the group, he's the leader of the group of Florentine painters who were sent to Rome at the request of the Pope to paint the walls of the Sistine Chapel. And he gets to do 3 of them and a whole row of pontiffs. And the reason you don't know this work, and even if you've been to the Sistine Chapel, you didn't look at it, is it's a flop. It turns out what he didn't get from his master, Filippo Lippi, was much gift for composing big groups. This is several stories taking place of Moses all at once. It fit the PowerPoint slide so perfectly I couldn't bear to make it smaller, so I wrote over it. And this is Moses, there's Moses taking off his shoes, Moses getting some water, Moses, I mean, you cannot figure it out. And I refuse to learn what these stories are. It really makes no sense. Beautifully frescoed. Well, the trip to Rome, he painted 3 huge things and 10 portraits of popes in a year. And with his assistants, it changed his way of working forever. And for one thing, he got addicted to using assistants. Well, I didn't use it on this one. After seeing Rome, he comes back, and you would think he went to Hollywood. He comes back and does this classical sculpture, the famous Venus Pudica, which means modest, and she is coming to shore because she represents love and the power of love, which is the Platonic idea of creation. Her arrival here, she is the moving force in the universe. So according to that Platonic theory, so she has to be everything. She has to be, yes, as beautiful as a goddess, but also strong, and also wise. That's why she's never, looking in a come-hither way. She always is, has an inward-looking glance. But they're solid, large figures right to the front of the picture plane, because that is like the classical art they could see. And I put it on here to compare. So now that you have these two works together, and I've explained that to you, you belong to an elite group of scholars who have no difficulty understanding the difference between them. And you will never say, I think they're both after the trip to Rome, which is the prevailing view. Now, that's completely unacceptable to us. May I speak for the group? Here is what he does for luxurious Madonna and Child after his trip to Rome and all of the classical collections and parties. And I will show you how totally different it is. Roman statues are rather generalized. They don't have great psychologies. They have great cheekbones. How touching. The one in which is the last traces of naturalism, far right, the one we have in our show. This is the famous Madonna of the Magnificat and would never ever be lent. It's considered one of the most precious pictures in the Uffizi. But doesn't the child look like the young Marlon Brando? There's quite a difference in them. And we have to appreciate every phase of a great artist's work for what it is. But honestly, something was lost. Now we have in the show this slender thing, this Venus, which is based on the famous painting. And she is very svelte, and she has a kind of lyrical feeling to her, and she's really rather quite different. We know from contemporary accounts that, quote, he painted beautiful pictures of nude women which one can see in houses in Florence. And we know that amongst the things thrown on the bonfires of the Vanities, this is still during the lifetime of Lorenzo, so it's not yet, were pictures of sensuous subjects. So we think, everyone thinks, that this one and the other one, which I think it's going to be fun, you'll see the other one that exists, and it's very different. Again, we think that they are the two that survive, the ones kept in the closet or under the bed, because we think there were more than just the two that survived the coming crackdown. Here is the other one. It's in Berlin. Interesting, isn't it? Notice already he changes the hair. The hair on the Venus here is such an important part of the conception of Venus there, and there's the wind. See, this is the wind god, and it doesn't happen. And the sway of the body is somewhat different. But I think this one is close in date to ours, and I think by the time he does ours, oh, how considerate of me, you just get to see them next to each other. And in an exhibition last December in London, they had them next to each other. That was useful to go and see. And you see how there's a curious, poetic or elegiac quality to the one we have. She's even more modest. See, she's wearing that transparent pen noir that extends all the way down the folds into the dark shadows. No photograph shows them. Here she is all sculptural, because that's what you do when you go to Rome. You learn by looking at sculpture, and here no sculpture, a spokesman for sculpture said he was glad no sculpture was involved. At any rate, it's not sculpturesque at all anymore. Look at that hand. How strange, it's so strong and harsh. I haven't the slightest idea what he was thinking with that wonderful thing. But I wanted now to say, when we opened the box on this, and all the couriers were looking at it, neither of these pictures have ever had particular acceptance as how could they be by him, because they're not the great Birth of the Venus. But this photograph is actually pushed too far. If I knew how to go backwards, I would. I wonder if this would work. No.
Back arrow.
It's very, very subtle, the modeling. And Dr. Groff said to me, we were all kind of amazed to see it so close up. It's superb, actually. Superb. And he said, how much of this do you think is by him? I said, nearly all of it. It didn't even look that good. The attitude of a person who hangs up a picture affects how you feel when you look at it. Well, this is around the same time, and this is an interesting thing. It's a new subject. They didn't paint these on things. They got these subjects from the works of the previous century, the 1300s, the most important literary century in the history of the world anywhere. Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. They write all the mythological encyclopedias, and also Boccaccio writes a completely licentious book of stories called the Decameron. You can't finish it because they're all the same, really. This is unusual that the three goddesses, Paris, the shepherd, must choose who is the most beautiful. Venus, Juno, or Minerva, or vice versa. He has, for unknown reasons, not done anything to identify them. We only figure this is Aphrodite or Venus because we know she won. What is this back here? But these are very familiar Roman monuments. Rome did not exist. But in this interesting literary bias of the time of Lorenzo il Magnifico, this event leads to him receiving the hand of Helen of Troy, who they forgot to vet her, and it turned out she was married to King Menelaus. And the Greeks had to get in ships and go to Troy to get her back. When Troy burned, Aeneas fled and found in Rome. So this shows what will happen, which is very literary. It's also something that was made as the back panel of a bench. This is a wedding chest, the story of Psyche, by a pupil and follower of Botticelli, and she's dressed in white. So her. Her sisters are saying, "Oh, you better look into that guy, your husband." Now we come to the last part of the show. We have this marvelous Christ. It's a shaped cross, painted on a cut-out cross. That's what we call it. And the great thing about this work is it's not in any book because it was never accepted. And when I asked the leading expert who helped us very much on this show, Alessandro Chucky, he said, he's the one who said, go to the corner of the tiny little museum attached to the Cathedral of Prato. There's a crucifix there that I swear is Botticelli. And when Dr. Groff and I saw it, we go, whoa, what a thing, 100% is this thing. And I said, why is it not in any book? They said, because Botticelli wouldn't paint such a subject. Really? What are we, psychologists now? I mean, he painted it. That's all you need to know. It's very, very beautiful. And as I studied it, I went back on a visit and showed this photograph of a well-known work to Dr. Chucky, because he had dated it to the mid-90s. And look, it's 91, 93. Look at ours here. See, these dates don't come with them. We decide them. He is beautiful in a way of the beautiful figures we've been saying, unmarked by the trauma of the passion. All of this has to do with the court of Lorenzo Magnifico. And in the other one, notice there's not these wonderful contours. It's a more tragic treatment of the subject, and a little bit repetitious, but the legs are parallel, not at all. And you know, when you show a great scholar something like this and say, you know, so I think you published the wrong date. I didn't phrase it that way. He said, you're right. That's why I pointed out, because it doesn't happen often enough. And that's we're added to the knowledge there. Now, Botticelli is not said to have influenced any artists after him. He just dies without leaving any trace. But in fact, his friend, who was 30 years younger, they had the same protector, and he was one of the few people, Botticelli, that Michelangelo respected. He didn't get along with anyone. He carved this crucifix for Santo Spirito in the same spirit that the beauty of Christ, it's an idea. Did I already show this? Wow. I found how to go backwards. Here we go. He did it the same way, with no trauma. This comes from a phrase that's on the label for this work. Comes from Augustine's narratives on the Psalms, in which he says, God is beautiful in entering this life, in leaving this life, in the tomb, on the cross. God is beautiful. And that's the theme here. Now, this is not a late work. It's 88. The late works begin with the 90s. But you see the wall there. This is the work we put before the late works to show that his identification with these great Christian themes was part of him. This is the funeral mask. They said, would you like the funeral mask of Lorenzo the Magnificent? So Aaron and I said, sure, throw it in the bag. I think it is great. And here's a picture of him from life by Ghirlandaio. And after his death, government of the city was taken over by Fra Savonarola, and that spelled a very tragic climate in the city. And here's a late work. We have an altarpiece in the exhibition. It's very, very hard to obtain altarpieces on loan. And what happens in these late works, I see this photograph also is pushed a little bit. That annoys me so much. But you can see that this voluminous outline is one of the signs of his late style. It looks like it's been blown up. He removes the weight from the body. He removes their physical presence. He wants them to represent who they are, but he's not pretending anymore that they're illusions. He gives away all the wonderful Renaissance things about perspective and volume. And he looks back to medieval art, and the quality of it is first rate. This is the face of St. John in that altarpiece. This is as great as Botticelli, gets. It's a fantastic piece of painting. And this work, too, is always just called workshop. I mean, let's have a look at them before we decide what they are. Look how wonderful, I won't leave the microphone, how wonderful, sort of impressionistic. The light doesn't hit this part of his mustache, just these first ones. I mean, this is just an instinctive understanding of how we see. Artists of all times had to be aware of that our vision is optical and also mental. This work should not be yellow like this, but this was the least yellow photo I could find of it. They are very pallid, and as the people who have seen the show and read the label, or had a chance to come on one of the tours, the docents were giving excellent tours, this is a remarkable work by him. Notice how it's all completely flat now. If she stood up, she'd hit her head on the frame. It's all fit in the way of a medieval illuminated manuscript. And the rose bower behind her goes straight down. No wonder the pre-Raphaelites and late 19th century English loved Botticelli. And they have a version of this in the city of Birmingham, in fact. And it's so strange because in the meeting of the cousins, Christ and his cousin, the Baptist, normally it's a moment, Leonardo da Vinci does it several times, Michelangelo does it, of a little lightheartedness, a Christian play date. But instead, they seem very somber. And actually, look at the infant's hand. He seems to be consoling the Baptist, and the Baptist seems more appropriate, his sadness, to a leave-taking. And she is very solemn because she always knows what's happening. At that time, it was easy for them to see. If we have a lot of experience of Italian painting, we can see this strange pose of holding the child sideways and lowering him evokes the deposition from the cross. So imposed on a scene, basically, of the Nativity is the Passion. As one happens in order to lead to the sacrifice. And here I'm concluding. This is a work, again in his late style, and this was in the Botticelli Museum, which lent that wonderful refined Madonna with the book. And this was in an important, very ancient, centrally placed church in Florence. And this is an early work, unfinished by Michelangelo, that no one has ever had any idea where he got this idea that, for the figures to be weightless and floating around. But everyone in this room knows more than all the books. This is exactly where he got the idea from, and one of his followers, Pontormo, made a very great painting of the same subject in the Church of Santa Felicita in Florence, based on this. So he did have tremendous influence. And that leads me to conclude this attempt to explain to you the artistic and spiritual journey of Botticelli.